Patient Zero, Chapter 4, Part 2, Round 2. Unfortunately for Mary, that wasn't the end of it. Very soon, George returned, bringing backup with him. Dr. Josephine Baker was a medical officer with the New York City Health Department. As one of the city's only female doctors, it was her job to get urine and feces samples from Mary to prove whether or not she was a typhoid carrier. As George Sofer had already discovered, it wasn't an easy assignment. When Dr. Baker and two burly New York City policemen showed up, Mary Mallon was suddenly nowhere to be found, and none of the other kitchen staff would tell them where she'd gone. Josephine and the police hunted through every closet and cupboard in the house, searching for the fugitive. They were ready to give up when the doctor noticed a bit of colored cloth caught in a closed door. It was the edge of Mary Mallon's long skirt, revealing her hiding spot in a tiny cupboard under the stairs. The doctor and the police had to haul the angry, fighting woman out of the house and into a waiting ambulance. They ignored her when she shouted that she wasn't sick and she didn't have typhoid and that she'd never been so insulted in her life. Afterward, Josephine remembered how the policeman lifted her into the ambulance and I literally sat on her all the way to the hospital. It was like being in a cage with an angry lion. Fecal blood and urine samples taken in the hospital confirmed what George Sofer had suspected. Mary was a typhoid carrier. In the early 1900s, 350,000 people in the United States became ill with typhoid every year. In New York City alone, there were more than 4,000 cases a year, and the city was trying to clean up its act and reduce the rates of infectious diseases such as typhoid. There were campaigns to clear the streets of garbage, manure, and sewage, and the city was working to establish safe drinking water supplies and sanitation for all its inhabitants. Typhoid wasn't as deadly as cholera, but it was a very serious disease. A crushing headache and fatigue were the first symptoms, followed by fever, diarrhea, and cramps. It took from 2 to 6 weeks of bed rest and medical care to recover from typhoid. A vaccine against Salmonella typhi was not developed until 1911, and antibiotics to treat the disease weren't available until 1948. In 1906, all that doctors could do was try to bring down their patients' fevers, watching and waiting for the disease to run its course. When George Soper started his investigation, no one understood exactly how typhoid spread. We now know that typhoid is caused by eating or drinking something contaminated with the bacteria, Salmonella typhi. People who have typhoid shed the bacteria in their poop. Other people can be infected by drinking water contaminated with sewage or by eating food that has been handled by an infected person who hasn't washed their hands thoroughly after going to the bathroom. This kind of disease transmission is called the fecal-oral route. To fight the disease, New York's health inspectors had to fight the march into homes where typhoid was suspected. They ordered sick people to stay home, and anyone who didn't follow their orders could be hauled off to a quarantine hospital. Even though Mary wasn't sick, George Soper had provided that she was transmitting typhoid, and the city's health department agreed that it would be dangerous to allow her to continue working as a cook. So Mary was sent into quarantine on a tiny island in the middle of New York's East River. Since the 1860s, North Brother Island had been used to quarantine patients with dangerous contagious diseases: smallpox, cholera, yellow fever, tuberculosis. Healthy, strong, able-bodied Mary Mallon was sent to live on the desolate, windswept island with the sick and dying as her only companions. Round 3. Mary fought back, writing letters, demanding her civil rights, and pleading for help to get her released from quarantine. 3 years later, the New York Supreme Court agreed to hear her case. While Mary was on the North Brother Island, a surprising thing had happened. 50 other healthy typhoid carriers had been identified just in the state of New York. Not one of them had been sent to North Brother Island. Health department officials admitted that perhaps they had overreacted. Mary won her case and her freedom on the condition that she agreed not to work as a cook again. In 1910, after 3 years as a prisoner of the New York City Health Department, she was allowed to cross the river back to New York City. The health department didn't see it as their responsibility to train Mary for new work. Instead, they gave her a job as a laundress, one of the hardest, worst paid jobs for a woman at that time. At first, they checked in with her frequently. Then, as the weeks and months passed, less and less regularly, finally, they lost contact with Mary altogether. What was she doing? Where was she living? It seemed no one cared longer about the healthy carrier who had caused such a stir only a few years before. Then, in 1915, a New York City maternity hospital had an outbreak of typhoid. 25 doctors and nurses got sick. 2 died. The hospital employment records showed that a new cook had been hired just weeks before the outbreak. The head of the hospital brought in George Super and showed him a sample of the cook's handwriting. George knew it right away. I saw it once, and that it was indeed Mary Mallon. Just to be sure, George called Josephine Baker to the hospital. Sure enough, Josephine wrote, there was Mary earning her living in the hospital kitchen, spreading typhoid germs among mothers and babies and doctors and nurses like a destroying angel. The health department sent Mary back to North Brother Island, where she stayed for the next 23 years. Mary died in quarantine in 1938. Villain or victim? From the beginning, newspapers had a field day with reporting on Mary Mallon's case. When an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1908 called her Typhoid Mary, the tabloid started using it too. Before long, Typhoid Mary was a household name. Today, we call anyone who spreads disease, intentionally or not, a Typhoid Mary. Mary Mallon's story still fascinates people. Articles and books and plays and movies have been written, looking for answers to the many questions we still have about her. Did she suspect before George Soper first approached her that she might have had something to do with the typhoid that struck all the family she worked for? Why did she risk going back to cooking after she finally won her freedom from North Brother Island? Was she a villain, or was she just an ordinary person whose life was ruined by an uncaring system? Mary was a woman, a servant, an Irish immigrant to the United States, unmarried and with little education. All those things meant she had very little power in the society in which she lived. Yet she wasn't afraid to chase officials away, elude doctors, fight the police, swear, argue, and write angry letters until the courts were forced to take notice of her. Doctors and officials were no doubt surprised to see Mary standing up for herself so fiercely, and her behavior may have branded her as a problem in their eyes. There's another reason Typhoid Mary's story continues to interest people. It raises questions about how far government should go when trying to protect public from epidemics. Was it fair to keep Mary Mallon in isolation for so long? During the SARS epidemic in 2003, the Ebola pandemic of 2014, and again when COVID-19 struck in 2020, people returning from affected areas were ordered into quarantine. Putting people into quarantine, even temporarily, means they have to lose their jobs and unable to provide for their families. Public health officials have to try to balance individuals' rights with the need to protect the public from disease.